On this episode, I'm interviewing Kay Rubacek, who has a stark warning for Americans. This is a fascinating interview. Her family fled communism 3 different times, and I think you're going to be shocked to hear what she has to share about her experience. She was actually jailed in China. She has firsthand experience of the evils of socialist and communist regimes, and it's quite unfortunate that many Americans are unaware of the dramatic impact that these communist ideologies are already having in our politics, our social constructs, and even the American Christian church. We also talk about the Chinese Communist Party's influences on America, how many of our American elite have sold out American values, and what we can do to stand up and save America, which includes maintaining truth and using our voices and refusing to compromise. This really is a fascinating interview, and you're going to be shocked by some of the parallels that we draw between the communist regimes and what's going on in their nations and what's going on in America today. It's really eerie, and you will see how some are more formalized and some are more informal, sort of happening behind the scenes, but then we see the same results, which shows us the root of what's going on. And we also talk about her new book that she released, where she actually interviews people who are involved in the slave labor prisons in China, and we dive deep into the mindset of those in those communist regimes and how they can perpetuate such evil. We close the interview with a high note and why we should be filled with hope and filled with excitement to continue to fight this together. This is a very timely and riveting interview. You're not going to want to miss it, so let's get into it right now.
This is Your Faith at Work, the show that helps you get your faith out of the church and into the world. God is on the move right now in the marketplace and culture through people just like you. You were created for influence and impact. Let's take your faith to the next level. Learn more at ryanshoward.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ryan S. Howard.
Hello and welcome to Your Faith at Work. I'm Ryan Howard, and I've got a very special guest with me today that has a very important message that is so relevant for us today here in America. I'm joined by Kay Rubacek, who is a celebrated author. She's an award-winning filmmaker. She has her documentaries featured on PBS and the Epoch Times and NTD. She is a third-generation fighter of communism. Her family fled communism in Russia back in the 1920s, and her husband fled Australia because of the rising socialism over 10 years ago. She's committed to fighting for truth and repelling all the components of communism and socialism in America today. And I think you're going to be surprised about our conversation. She is a committed Christian with her husband and children living in upstate New York, and she has a new book called Who Are China's Walking Dead, which is a firsthand account of all the oppression, violence, and propaganda in China from real victims and their stories. Kay, welcome to Your Faith at Work. Thank you for joining us.
So glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, there's a lot to unpack there. I just love your message and all this success you've had and how God has used you in these ways. But maybe just give us a little intro, some of your story, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Thank you. I think, I started actually doing video production almost 25 years ago in Australia, and I worked as a professional producer doing videos, gaming, educational programming for children. And, that was, there was a certain amount of success there with awards and retail success. But when you switch over into something like this, talking about communism and socialism, it becomes a whole nother ball game and challenges that have been on my path. But definitely with the Lord's help, I've been able to get through that and continue. Though it's, of course, there's a lot of challenges along the way, but a lot of learning. So, as you mentioned, my family escaped communism 3 generations in 3 countries, Russia, China, actually as well, where my father was born and raised as a young Russian boy there, and then had to escape to Australia. And my husband's family from the former Czechoslovakia. So it was very interesting just to see how my family, who were very strong religious believers, they escaped for their freedom, but my husband's family, who were atheist, they escaped because they wanted free will. So even though they didn't necessarily know that they were leaving for faith in some sense, they had a sense that they recognized that there's something special about freedom and having free will as a human being. So this has my professional background in producing has allowed me to really step over and use my skills, I think, for a greater mission, a greater purpose. And that's, I think that's been a real, really powerful journey for me. And it hasn't ended. You know, we still got a long way to go. And I did myself, I've had the experience of not only interviewing a whole lot of victims of communism, from my family to people who have survived brainwashing and torture in labor camps, some who have been broken by that, others who came out with even the ability to smile on the other end. I've also interviewed people who perpetrated torture and brainwashing, and officials who carry out that communist totalitarianism and that sort of socialistic thinking that they're doing it today. And so I've been able to interview people like that and learn. In my own experience, I also spent a day in a Chinese prison cell for being a human rights advocate in China in 2001. And those kinds of experiences, they change you. And it did set me on a course where I chose not to pursue Hollywood. I chose to pursue a more challenging route, but definitely a more meaningful and purposeful route, which has brought me to this, where, you know, so glad to be able to speak with people such as yourself who understand that, you know, we need to get these messages out. We need to start paying attention to the bigger things in life that really drive us forward and make a big difference in the long run. I think that's where we've got to start looking at the bigger picture now, looking what's going on around our world right now.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of it has been hidden. And with all of this COVID stuff, a lot of that's come to the surface. And I think a lot of people who were sleeping before are now kind of had their eyes ripped open to like, this is what's going on. And I think now you were, tell us about, we got so much to unpack here, but tell us about Australia, because I mean, they've been, how did you make your way there? And you left there, and now we see today, I mean, they had some of the most restrictive stuff with COVID. I mean, it is just insane, the kind of stuff that we see there. But I guess that's not a country that would normally be at the top of people's minds when they think of socialism or communism. So unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when I grew up in Australia, so I was born and raised to Russian in a family of Russian immigrants in Sydney, Australia, and my family didn't talk about communism or socialism, even though they had escaped it. They found freedom, and this is what happens when people find freedom. They leave tyranny, they forget it, and then tyranny becomes someone else's problem. And that it's not their fault. This is what happens. We get comfortable. We get along. We have to get along with the daily grind. We got to raise our kids. We got to educate ourselves. We got to put food on the table. We just get into the day to day and we forget. And you can't be thinking about tyranny all the time when you've escaped it. Right? You don't want that, the sadness or the pressure or the people have to put that away in a box because it's really heavy stuff that what my father experienced growing up in China. And but so they didn't want us to know about it. They felt that we didn't need to know. But Australia started changing, and the Chinese Communist Party plays a massive role in the institutions in Australia, in funding that, and that's something that now Australians have started to wake up to. The COVID pandemic has really put a bullseye on that, where people are now really starting to pay attention. But I was indoctrinated with socialist education when I went to college in Australia, and I dropped out. I saw what was happening. I didn't really understand it at the time. That was more than 20 years ago. But when I was there, I was studying in the Department of Fine Arts. And what I was being forced to do was to become more of a propagandist and marketer. And I was not learning any traditional art. I was not learning how to be an artist. I was being trained to be a marketer, to be a propagandist, to be an organizer, to be someone that wanted to look down on others. I was trained to think that I was smarter, better, more deserving than others who were not in my field, and that I should use my field to manipulate and change people's thinking. and definitely to change it away from anything traditional. We were not encouraged. So I thought there's really something wrong with this picture. And if I stay in this course, and if I stay in that career, I'm in trouble. I'm really in trouble. And so I left and I went on a journey of rediscovery and rediscovering faith and coming back to understanding the difference between socialism, which is godless, which is atheistic, and having faith and really understanding what we come from. We are created in the image of God, and that's, when you that's sort of those. It's such a big difference when you realize that science also supports art. Traditional art also supports that concept that we come from somewhere greater and we have that spirit in us, and that allows us to have this immense power that, on the other hand, these people that want to use socialism to control and remake society, they don't have that power and they never will. So I certainly didn't learn that in college. Mm-hmm. And so when I left college, I took that journey, and eventually I came to America because I knew if I stayed in the US, if I stayed in Australia and made films, they just wouldn't have the reach that I could have in the US. The US just has the market, and Australia really is used by big corporations. I learned this when I did some postgraduate studies in Australia. I learned that Australia is used as a testing ground for many corporations in the world because it's a small market and they can see how people will react, and consumers will react, seeing us as consumers. And so when I saw what was happening with the pandemic and what was happening in Australia, I just thought, oh no, this is what they're testing. And they're rolling out what's being done in China under the Chinese Communist Party there. They're testing that out in Australia and seeing how this will be used in the West. And then they started rolling those policies out in other parts of the world. And they've used that as a testing ground. They, as in people that have this socialistic type mentality, that have these other wishes going on behind the scenes. So, yeah, unfortunately, Australia's used that way, and I was able to leave it. But I mean, I've still got family there, and it's sad to see it going that way. But we look to America for as a beacon of hope, and I think it's important to be here and do what we can to keep America maintaining its values. Otherwise, Australia will be in trouble. Well, Australia won't exist if America doesn't exist. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. I mean, and that's why we really need to be sounding the alarm here in America, because we're seeing a lot of that sneak in here, and it's not really even sneaking in now. It's kind of in your face now. And I mean, and I want to kind of get into that a little bit, but you mentioned the university and what was happening with propaganda and sort of just you're being trained there. I mean, have you looked into this sort of in America? I mean, I think it's no secret what's happening in our universities and how it's just even these scientific fields have sort of been taken over by some of this stuff. What can you share about some parallels that you're seeing here in America?
I think perhaps it started in America before it did in Australia, the indoctrination, because it actually started a long time ago. And so what we're seeing now, as you said, now it's in our faces. Now it's really hard for us to run. I say there is nowhere left to run. My family escaped. They ran away from communism. They had places to go to. There is nowhere left to run. The borders are being decimated in this global world. Everything exists now in terms of government structures, corporational interrelationships, and the global economics and all of that. It exists to have global tyranny, and that infrastructure is in place. As to how far developed until they can flick that switch and do whatever they need to do, I don't know. But what I've seen is that I've studied the plans and the writings and the people who want this type of socialistic tyranny. They haven't hidden their plans. So it's just a matter of that they have just constantly tried to distract us and say that we don't need to know, or that we're not worthy of knowing, or they think it's too stupid to know, which isn't true, but we have been distracted. So we've been distracted while they have intentionally rolled out a long-term campaign to infiltrate our institutions, starting with education, absolutely, and take that over and put in a liberal progressive education so that now our youth are being indoctrinated from a very young age. And because I've done a lot of studies in China, when I've interviewed more than 100 survivors of communism, and those who knew freedom before, say, for example, my family, they knew a world before communism. They knew a world before this tyranny. So once they went into another free country, they were able to readjust and get their minds back, and they were able to get back to back to normal, back to human life. But for people in China, the generations, because communism has been there for 70 plus years, that's the best example for us as to the worst thing that can happen, because their youth have grown up completely indoctrinated by a one-party totalitarian state under complete atheism. So even when they come here, people say to me, what about these Chinese students? They come here, don't they love America? They should change. And I said, they've been taught since they were children, since they were babies, that they hate America. That's what they've been taught. Even though they come here, they want to receive tuition here. They want to receive benefits from here. They say they want freedom, but they often just go back to China because they're not used to not being told what to do. They're not used to free thinking. And they say they generally think they would rather be told and comforted by Big Brother Chinese Communist Party than have the freedom and free will of a state that no one's telling them what to do, unless they find faith. If they find faith, those ones I found were much more, they could adjust to freedom because they could free their mind and take it away from the party. But those who didn't, it was very hard for them to adjust. And that's what I'm afraid of, is that for our youth who if they don't know freedom, they will not, it's hard for them to get back to it.
Well, and that's that's a fascinating point, because being taught to hate America is what they're being taught there. And what is happening now, you have all of these younger generation people talking about the problems of America and trying to do the revisionist history stuff with like the 1619 Project and all these different things, trying to have people basically using their American freedom to talk about how they don't like America and it's just sort of a crazy thing to have happening. And when you start to talk to them about, when you see these interviews and people asking them about, okay, well, do you want to have everybody wear the same shoes, or do you want to have this and that? And they're like, well, no, I like this choice. And it's, and they, they don't get that X leads to Y leads to Z, and not really putting that together. And that's why it's so important to be talking now. I mean, we're late to this game. I mean, as far as this, and I think the church needs to be speaking up about these things. I mean, that's how our nation was founded in the first place, was our founding fathers, and doing what God had called them to do, and having a more biblical nation. And so, but I want to get into, let's go back to China. So you did a lot of research in China, and you've been a day in prison. So tell us, how did that happen? I mean, and what was the, why were you arrested? What experience did you have? I mean, what happened there?
So because even though my family had escaped communism, like I said, I didn't know what it was. I hadn't been taught in schools. I'd learned about the crimes of Nazis. I was never taught the crimes of communism, even though communist dictators have killed more people than the Nazis, more people than any wars. I didn't know, and my family didn't talk about it. So I started practicing a meditation called Falun Dafa, which originated in China. And so I had, great health benefits, and then it started getting persecuted in China. And I'm thinking, what is going on? This is like, they started, making it illegal and rounding people up. And I'm like, This is like trying to outlaw yoga or jogging in a park in the US, not one park, but the whole park, because it was so popular that the government themselves said there were 70 to 100 million people practicing, more than members of the Chinese Communist Party, and many members of the Chinese Communist Party were practicing. So it's just very traditional. And in China, healthcare is a completely different system. So a lot of people were benefiting from the health. The health, it was saving the government even reported that it was saving them a lot in healthcare costs.
Wow.
So, yeah, and crime rates were going down. So there was it's a very different country in China, and so they outlawed this group of individuals across the nation, and they started arresting, and they even started persecuting. And so I'm in Australia thinking, what's going on? And then I saw this slanderous lies and propaganda coming out about it. And I'm like, well, that's not true. I know that's not true. So this is exactly straight out of the communist playbook. We're seeing that here. A group gets targeted. The media is used to slander them, label them, create lies, and then find negative events that they can attach and blame on this group that aren't true. Or have been fabricated or twisted in some way. And then the public starts to support that form of persecution against those groups of people. Sound familiar here? Well, I experienced that 20 years ago. And then I heard about an elderly woman in China who was tortured and beaten to death for this. And I was like, I don't believe, I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it. I just can't believe human beings can be that cruel to each other. And so more and more people started to die and were tortured for this and killed. And I said, this is just not on. That could be me. If that was in Australia, it would be me. And I'm a bit of a stubborn person. So if something's helping me and I like doing it, I'm probably not going to stop. Maybe if you even put a gun to my head, I don't know, like not for sure. But anyway, I heard of some Americans, Caucasians, white guys who were not Chinese, were going to protest a peaceful appeal on Tiananmen Square. And they set a time and a place. And they said, if anyone wants to come, but be quiet. Don't blow the cover. Just there are risks. If you want to join, be there at your own risk. So I turned up with a friend of mine. And I was holding a banner that had 3 words: truth, compassion, and tolerance. And I was arrested on Tiananmen Square within 30 seconds after that banner went up, surrounded by police. 30 seconds.
Wow.
30 seconds. There's video evidence of that. 30 seconds. I counted, I think, 28 seconds before the siren started. The police came out. There are more undercover police officers on Tiananmen Square in the capital city of Beijing than there are uniformed. So I was surrounded by these ununiformed police officers, and I'm 6 foot tall. I'm quite tall. These guys were not tall. So they're looking at me and I'm looking at them, and I look over and I'm holding a banner, and all that's left, everyone else has been pulled off the banner, violently thrown into vans. And I look over and I'm holding the word compassion. I was arrested in a public place in China for holding the word compassion. I did nothing else wrong. I broke no law. And within 30 seconds, I was beaten, violently thrown into a van, taken to a basement prison cell, locked there. I was interrogated quite viciously, but not violently. I witnessed other people being treated very violently. A friend of mine had nose bleeding, fingers broken. Others were sexually assaulted if they were got on their own. So you never want to be. We need to stick together in these situations. And I witnessed really devious uses of manipulative propaganda techniques against me, against others. But what I experienced, what I got the most out of this experience, is that my family escaped. They ran away from communism. But then I naively and ignorantly went head to head with it. And what could they do to me? All they could do was they bought me a plane ticket to get out of there as fast as they could get me out of there to keep me quiet. Even when they took me to the airplane, they took me through this sort of secret passageway so that I couldn't have any contact with any other people in their nation to put me on the airplane. And when I got on the airplane, I stood up and told everyone what I was being deported for. And there was nothing the air hostesses could do at that point, and
Wow.
sat down and had a nice journey home.
Yeah.
But this is where tyranny is most afraid of truth. They are built on lies and deceit and hatred and violence, and it cannot withstand the truth. So that was my biggest take-home message and experience from surviving imprisonment as China is in under the biggest tyranny at the moment, the largest tyrannical regime, is that we don't have to run away, and right now there is nowhere else to run. It's here. It's right here in the US. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has infiltrated most of our institutions and definitely most of our media. I've had my movies and films blocked in many places. Even film festivals have been too scared. Not all of them. There's some very brave ones, but there's some that have said, we are too scared to show your movie. We are too scared to review your book, because they have sold out their American values. And they have said, even colleges have said to me, I'm sorry, we have to cancel the screening of your movie in our ethics or bioethics class, because we have too many students from China that are paying tuition and we cannot afford to lose the funding. So we are selling out for a few bucks, selling out our values, and all these compromises allow us, they just open the door more and more to say, come on in, tyranny, we're ready for you to take us over. So the CCP is laughing at us because we are so distracted by things like gender theory and racial issues that they can just come right in under. And while one day we'll wake up and we've just lost control because we've been too distracted on these issues.
Yeah, and that's we'll come back to this, the China, because I know this is with your book, Who Are China's Walking Dead? And I want to come back to that, but let's camp out on this pattern you mentioned about the media involved, and you got the targeted group, the media, and then you have an event or something to blame them on. This is something, now this was like 20 years ago, right? I mean, this was when you, like, that's not ancient history. That's like, not long ago. And this is still going on today, maybe even worse, in China today. And it's no secret, yet they're participating in global commerce and all these things because, let's let them in and then they'll change and be more like us. And it's like, no, they came in and now they're changing everybody else to be more like them. And they're doing it through this infiltration. But maybe this pattern you mentioned about targeted and media supporting that, and then an event to blame on. I mean, I think everybody can probably name some examples of seeing that here, but could you talk a little bit about that here in America, how that's working out?
Yeah, it's working out too well. Now, there are so many people that have blown the whistle on this for decades. We are coming in late on this. I'm coming in late on this, but it's never too late. And so we have all these shoulders of giants to stand upon and say, oh, we're not on our own. We're not on our own. So you look at so divide and conquer. What we got to remember is the strategies that these guys use. They have used for probably just over a century, if not longer, and they haven't changed. All they've done is just they've made it better. They tested it out in Soviet Russia. How many people took over Russia? The world's largest nation. It was like 1,000 or 2,000 Bolsheviks. They just hijacked an event that was happening in the nation. They took over. They took advantage of that. They caused hatred, division, and then they took control. So it doesn't take many people. And it's exactly the same thing here. They've tested it through all these other countries, and they've just been doing a soft form in America first because the whole world knows that America has a special condition. You can't just come in. We never had a monarchy here. We never had a tsar. We never had a king. We never had an emperor. So all these other countries that had that history, they could take over in a different way. And they did with bloody violence and many other ways. But in America, they have to break our spirit. because the rugged American individualism is so powerful, and the belief in God is so powerful. So they have to break us down in another way. So, for example, they will cause a division in society. So you look around, how many divisions are there? Everywhere now. It's like, how do you not pick a side? We are being forced to pick sides. And then when you pick a side in a debate, well, it's no longer a debate. It's now becoming an argument. And then it's not an argument anymore. It's a war. It's violence. If you're on this side, I am now justified to hurt you. And if you're on this side, I must hate you. So this is the psychological process that they have tested out since Soviet times very precisely. Man, they're good at it. These guys are so focused on what they do. They know how to do it really well. So if we think that we're dealing with amateurs that are testing something out here in America, no, it's not the case. They are pro. They are pro at dastardly deeds. And they can justify it in their minds. You read any of their writings, they've published this stuff. It's not rocket science to work it out. You just have to want to look at it. And some of their writings are just awful to read. But yes, it's happening here. Divide, conquer, make people hate. And then you can get in the way of that, take advantage of one group, and then use it for something else. Have the media come in, you take that group out, they are destroyed. You destroy all opposition until there's no more opposition, and everything just becomes one status quo. And that's when we lose diversity. They're using diversity to separate us, but actually, in the end, we lose all diversity. So that's where we're being duped, and we really shouldn't fall for that.
Wow. That's such an amazing point, how the diversity that they're kind of pushing is actually what's going to be going away with this is successful. So, I mean, one of the things I like about your writing and your work is how you're focused on solutions and how there's still hope. I mean, with these kinds of things, this division, this sort of thing, like the everyday American, like what should we be doing to do what we can to stand against this? What sticks out to you that we can do?
Well, exactly what you're doing. So you were saying earlier, I mean, one, you're talking about it, brilliant. You know, it's actually kind of, you know, the solutions that I've found, and through researching and interviewing people who've undergone brainwashing, people who've done brainwashing, people who've studied brainwashing and torture, they cannot break the human spirit. It is really so simple. And they cannot undermine the truth unless we let them. So if we compromise, if we accept lies, then we are accepting tyranny. It's like, you know, if we do business with China, we are dealing with a criminal state. And it's not just me saying that. There's been an international legal tribunal, the China Tribunal in 2019, with, headed by very high-profile former prosecutors and experts in crimes against humanity and genocide. They've said, you know, there's many people who've said we're dealing with a criminal state in China. The killing, the torture, and the abuse there is not new. But we are compromising. So when we send our business over there and say, well, I'll get my factories over there and I'll just pretend they're not doing slave labor. I'll just pretend that it's somewhere else doing prison, slave labor and all of that sort of torture and abuse. We're compromising. We're saying it's okay to murder those people, but as long as it's not me. It's okay to hurt those people as long as it's not me. But it's here now, and it's no longer that. So we've compromised too much, and we will be the last ones left standing, and we'll have no one else to help defend us if we don't stick together right now. And it's just maintaining truth and not being afraid to talk about it, because we're being told that we're in a minority and that the majority of the country wants perversion in our education, and that they want us to, that our children deserve to be sexualized at a very young age, and that religion should be excluded from all aspects of life. All of these things, we're being told that we're a minority and that we're out of favor. That's a media propaganda tactic to make us feel alone, isolated, depressed, And then we get locked in our homes and afraid to see others. And then we get less connected. And so we just are just connected to the media feeds that we have on our phones, and the short-term thinking of swiping, not reading books, just reading a headline, just looking at an image and thinking that's the truth. So we have to dig a little deeper. We do have to open our minds. We do have to think a little more, but we're totally capable of that. And we do have to stick together. And one of the really, other than faith, something that really holds people through brainwashing, and this has been proven time and again in many experiments and in actual cases with survivors, is that those who have strong family ties are the hardest to brainwash, because there's someone in the world that's worth living for. There's someone in the world that needs you. And there's someone in the world that you know is outside of this tyranny that's trying to break you down. So right now, people who are speaking the truth are being told that they're in a minority and that they're on their own. But if we can strengthen our families, if we can strengthen our faith and talk about it, we'll find that we're really not in the minority, and that it's likely just a propaganda tool used against us, and that we shouldn't compromise, and we shouldn't allow anything to remove our free will, because we have the right to choose, we have the right to debate, we have the right to agree to disagree, and maintain the wonderful diversity of that this nation was built on, and we should be able to do that. So we just have to not compromise. It's a really fundamental point.
And that's something that really we saw sort of like a dress rehearsal during COVID for the willingness to compromise. And even the church, the church shut down, kind of forgot about that whole Constitution thing we have. And now I think that was God's grace that let us go through that sort of dress rehearsal, like I say, this mini version, because then everybody got sort of on the other side of it and is like, whoa, wait a minute, what just happened? I need to repent of a few things. We're kind of woken up to this. And I think I really like what you pointed out about Australia because I've kind of heard before about how it's that's where they kind of test these things out. But I hadn't really connected it with the fact that businesses do that all the time, because they get quick feedback and they can see, how things work there. And so that's a great connection. And we saw all of that. I like the point too, like you said, it's not really testing here. It's just the next step in the process, and it's sort of chipping away. And if we can just stay connected to people, we can keep the truth, not knowingly giving false or giving into these sorts of things, and strengthening families. All of these things, these biblical, godly values, these like what God created us to come here and do. You're like, that's what we need to do. And it's like, okay, let's do the basics. And the basics are what we can't lose sight of. And all of these other things, we take our eye off the ball, and we sort of can just be distracted very easily. And all of a sudden you wake up and you have the kinds of things that we had. And so being informed, and I think that what's really neat is we're seeing this go into the political realm, where real biblical candidates are starting to stand up, at least here in some of these states, where we're seeing people stand for the values and not apologizing, and actually playing offense and not just backing up on their heels the whole time. And so there's more hope there, and we need to double down on that as well. So I want to talk a little more about this book you have. So tell us about this. You interviewed labor camp director from China, former high-ranking Chinese Communist Party officials, a propaganda official, a journalist there, an army colonel, a judge, a diplomat, a secret national security agent. This is an incredible list that you had. And I know we were talking before we started recording about how there's a lot of background, a lot of cultural differences and things that have to be unpacked there. And that's why you had to put it in the book, to have these stories and understanding and depth to be able to really get into it. But tell us about this book called Who Are China's Walking Dead?
So this book, I was sitting on it for 5 years, because I had these interviews done, and I knew the information was important, and I knew the access I had was very rare to get these guys to speak. I was only able to get a dozen or so on camera, because I wanted to include them in a movie that I was making called Finding Courage, about a family's story, triumph over tragedy, and really give that example that yes, we can, through faith and family, we can overcome, and they show that in the movie. But what they didn't show in the movie, because I had these wonderful interviews with this family. We got secret access inside a Chinese labor camp for the movie footage there, and wow. People risked their lives to get this footage out, and we included that. But what was not in the movie at the time when I was making it was that no one could tell me and explain to me why is communism so evil? Who did this? Who did the torture? And what do they use? Why do they do that? How do they think? I care about the psychological side of things too, because I think that's what we need to understand. We're humans. And so as a journalist, I got to check every box and make sure that I've done my research. So I said, okay, this family is wonderful. It's a great story, but I need a little bit more. So I said, okay, I have to find someone who can tell me what it's like to do this torture. And so I found this man from... I'd read a report about a man who had defected. He had run multiple labor camps, slave labor camps in China.
Wow.
And he agreed to talk with me. It took a while to get him to agree, but he did agree. And he said, I expected him to think how I think. I expected him to think that prison's bad or to think that slave labor is bad. I expected him to think that torture's wrong. No.
Wow, really?
No. You have to change the baseline. When you are dealing with a communist country, a country that has a socialist ideology driving and educating people from 0 to 100, the baseline is out the window. We are not dealing with America. You cannot treat China you cannot think of it as a normal country or a government. It is beholden to an evil specter, the specter of communism. Karl Marx called it a specter. It's a demon, if you want to give it those terms for anyone that's thinking that way. I mean, we've got to call it what it is. That's what Karl Marx called it. So anyway,
yeah,
this guy, I'm talking to him about prisons, and I'm expecting him to have some sort of moral baseline that I have, and he doesn't. And it's very eye-opening. And then I interviewed another one. This was a former police chief who was one of the officials who pulled the trigger in the Ministry of Security at the time in 1989 when 10,000 students were killed by CCP soldiers and tanks on Tiananmen Square for asking for democracy. And so he was one of the ones that pulled the trigger against the students. And he said to me toward the end of the interview, he said, we are walking corpses. We've become walking corpses. And I had a translation coming in through simultaneously into an earpiece, and I had to stop the interview there because I said, I need to understand this term. This sounds important. And she said, the translator said, walking corpses, soulless bodies, walking flesh. And I'm thinking, I don't like this. I said, how about walking dead? She said, yeah, that's a fair translation. I said, well, okay, if anything we can understand in the West, we can understand that. We've seen zombies on plenty of TV shows. We get this. And so I asked him to continue, and he continued explaining. And I didn't like that term at all. And but because it came up, I'm a researcher. I had to do my due diligence. Every interview I conducted after that, I started asking every official, have you heard of this term before? And they're like, oh, yeah. I'm like, what does that mean to you? And they're like, what are you talking about? They said, they all knew it. They were like, yeah, this is what we do. And this is what happens. This is our lives. And there was an academic in Hong Kong who had, when the Communist Party took over China, a number of academics escaped, and they just said this is not going to work out because they knew the communist ideology was against humanity. That's ultimately what it is. It's against humanity. It's against trying to play God, and they said this is going to destroy us. This is worse than any other bad leaders that they've had in the past. This ideology will destroy us. We will become the walking dead. This was more than 50 years ago. They said we will become the walking dead. And that's what these officials have told me they've become, and the society has become. And I don't like to say that every Chinese person, I've interviewed so many wonderful people, and so I cannot say that everyone is. And that's why I have titled the book, Who Are China's Walking Dead? Because I let them answer that question themselves. But to give another anecdote, and I tell the story in the book is full of stories. You can pick up any chapter and just read that chapter, and you'll learn something about one aspect of the society there and what could become of us if we let it. There was a translator who was translating for me for an interview for another high profile official. And after about a 2-hour interview, she came out afterwards and she was very shaken. And she said, Kay, I've been living outside of China now for more than 20 years. And I never realized this until now. She said, whenever I say the word Chinese Communist Party in Chinese, she says, I feel a warmth in my heart, that the same love that I feel for my mother.
Wow.
And she said, I feel sick. I hate it. She says, I have tried to get away from this regime and I thought I was away from it. But she said that pain, that feeling is still there. And she says, I know it's wrong. But she says, this is what I grew up with as a kid, being taught that I love the Communist Party as my mother. And that's where the party breaks down the family and directly controls the individuals. And they are taught to, don't worry about your family. The party is first. Don't worry about God. There is only the party. And so these are some of the stories that I tell in my book. And that's why I think it's so important that we understand it's the ideology. It's the specter of communism. That's how it destroys an individual. It's how it destroys a nation. And I don't want to see that happen I don't want to see that go any further, especially once I've had access to this information. I felt that it was a duty to share it, I guess.
Well, and we're grateful that you have, because right there, what you said about putting it on par with the parents. What do we see here in the U.S.? We see parental rights sort of being circumvented in some of these states, and saying even if giving a child transgender hormones or treatments or vaccinations without the parents even knowing about it, and even deceiving parents. Does everybody connect that? What's the difference? There's no difference. That's the same propaganda, the same communist, Marxist ideology behind that, and not having value for human life. Like I hadn't heard that before. What you said about it's just walking flesh. That's just the way they see it. And I've been to China half a dozen times. I've sourced business in China for China. I love the Chinese people. They're incredible people. And but the CCP, that's fascinating to hear that's the way they view it in many cases. And
just on that note, I think you made a really important distinction that I forgot to mention. It's fundamentally important that the CCP is not China. The CCP is not the Chinese people. But in China, you will see throughout the media nationwide that they will say China cannot exist without the CCP. The Chinese people cannot exist without the CCP, and that they are one and the same. So this is where we in the West have been duped by that as well. I've had many colleagues say to me, well, if we didn't have the CCP, China would fall into chaos. Propaganda lie. You are repeating a propaganda lie when you say that. So we have to know where information is coming from, but we also have to have a moral baseline, and that's the fundamental thing, because we can't just go and research everything all day, and we can't become untrusting people. We are a trusting people, especially people who follow God are a trusting people, but the communists know that they can take advantage of that, because they feel that they can dupe us into replacing our faith with a materialistic faith and sell out for a few extra bucks here and there. So that's sort of a fundamental thing. But yes, China is not the CCP, and the CCP is not the Chinese people. The Chinese people are wonderful human beings. That they are human beings. We've got so much more in common than we have dissimilar, but they've been beholden to this evil regime for a long time now, and we're seeing the effects of that.
And now, you mentioned these institutions have sold out the American values, like you had mentioned, and like starting with education. And I've even seen in the church, there's a documentary called Enemies Within the Church that talks about how this has come into the church as well. And you've got this propaganda coming in, and people, that's where we need to be studying the Bible for ourselves. We need to be like the Bereans, where we hear what, like Acts 17:11, what we hear and receive it with all eagerness, but we search the scriptures to find out if it is so, as it was said. And that's where, we need to do more of that. We need to be self-feeding, and it's just unfortunate and evil to see these corporations and all this selling out happening in these different institutions.
And we need to look at where it's coming from, because ultimately it's we see they're just pushing that ideology for some reason. They might not even realize it. The socialists call them dupes. Those politicians who are being used, and they pay them out, or they blackmail and bribe them, or members in the church that they take advantage of. Leaders in the church that they find some way to compromise and take advantage of. It still comes back to this evil ideology that is conspiring to use them. And that's where, if we can stay clear on what our values are, then we know where things are going to end. We know where things are going to end, that we probably have tough times ahead, but there is always hope at the end when you have faith. And so that's ultimately, I think, where we need to be, because the divide and conquer strategy is used throughout the church as well. It's used throughout every organization. That why does socialism want to target the church? Why do they want to target the Boy Scouts? Why do they want to target veterans? Because they understand, they have strong values, but they also understand American values. And many of them have been taught that communism is evil. And so they need to break down those groups and make us fight. They make us fight against each other and say, well, I don't like you anymore. I'm going to go over here now. Oh, I don't like you anymore. I can't talk to you anymore. They want to sow that division so that we become weak. And once we are weak, that's when they take advantage. They only need a few people to make us weak in their minds. And then, well, that's what they've proven. And once we start to fight and lose our moral baseline, we start to fight and get angry with each other and everything, and then we can't talk to each other anymore. We break apart. They come in right in the middle and they push it apart completely, and they grab whoever they want and the ones that they know they can use, and they'll take advantage of that and push everyone else down. So that's where we have to we got to remember not to break apart, not to let them sow that division, not to fall for that hatred, and not to allow that hate to really break our hearts, because that's a tactic they're trying to use on us.
Yeah, that's and doing everything in love and staying connected and those sorts of things. And like you talked about family and faith, and it's all so critical. And again, it's the basics of what we should be doing anyway. And we can't get distracted by some of these divisions that are easy to fall for in some cases. But when you sort of see the agenda and you see the tactics, you can't really unsee them. In fact, you sort of see them more clearly and more easily. And it's like a little child who they act a certain way, and then you finally see the pattern, and then, it doesn't bother you anymore. You just understand that's what's happening, and you react to it appropriately. And that's sort of what we need to be doing here, and not keep taking the bait, so to speak, and letting them continue to leverage that against us.
Absolutely.
So what are some, in those interviews that you did for this book, was there other things that shocked you or sort of surprised you, or other individual stories that you heard from some of these people you interviewed that you'd want to share?
Basically, every chapter in the book is a shock that I started with. So I started with something that shocked me or perplexed me, that I couldn't understand, and then I would break that down. And I'll share another one. I have a chapter on propaganda. So I interviewed a propaganda official, actually multiple propaganda officials, multiple journalists working for the propaganda department. And this one particular propaganda official, he said to me, at the time he didn't realize, but he had been trained in his department that propaganda in China has 2 layers of skin. And he said, I didn't quite know what that meant at the beginning, but over time I understood. And I said, well, can you tell me what that means? And he said, yeah, it's you have to have two layers of skin, because the outer layer is the lie and the inner layer is the truth. But you can't let the truth come out, because if the truth came out, then everything would fall apart. So you have to hide the truth in the inner layer, and the outer layer is the lie. But they justify it this way. They teach the journalists. In my book, I've got a photograph that was taken at a training session for journalists in China, a very large training session, commonplace, and they have a special Marxist-Leninism training segment, and they make very clearly that journalists do not do news; they do propaganda. They do not do angles; they do spin. And I list all the points that are on this slide that they have on the stage training all these so-called journalists, and I've got that translated in my book. And I pull out a bunch of propaganda. The propaganda department regularly releases statements to tell all the media what they're allowed to say and what they're not allowed to report on. So through an organization in California that translates these ones, I was able to get access to translations of some of them, especially around the time of the COVID pandemic. And I just traced the steps of what they were saying. No, we can't talk about this. No one talk about that. This, we must negate the impact of that. They use all this communist language and things, but that's why I needed to write a book, because if I just put those words up on the screen, you'll look at it and say, oh, it's not that bad. But when you understand what they're actually saying, then you're like, oh my gosh, they're saying you must lie about this. And if anyone asks you about that, cover up and say this. This is what they have, black and white. And they put these directives out all the time. And they say, this is the outer layer of skin. This is the lie we have to give. But they don't call it a lie, because to them, that's now their truth. This is where that socialist ideology doesn't have a baseline. They told me, they said, we don't have, if we have to achieve something, we do whatever it takes to do that. Lie, cheat, steal, kill. Nothing's out of bounds. So that's the type of regime that we're dealing with now here in the US too.
Well, and that's exactly right, because and this is a must-read book for everybody listening, and the parallels are really shocking. I mean, if we just look at COVID, China's not the only place that only had certain things that were allowed to be said. And even the president of the United States, Donald Trump, was canceled, so-called canceled, for certain things that he had said. Or, I mean, it's just dumbfounding to me. And, I haven't read any slides in America, but we don't need the slides to see what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. We see whether this training is happening or not. And I did another interview about the cancel culture and how many people are self-canceling because they don't want to come up against this. And that's sort of the intimidation and, hey, just be quiet and don't say anything, don't rattle the cage. And the problem is, then what's upon us if that's what the path we choose to go down. And so once again, another parallel here in America, and all of these things, like I said, it's God's grace, I believe, that let us see all of this very clearly. And now we really have no excuse, even though we did it before, but now it's even more abundantly clear that now's the time. We need to stand up. We need to sound the alarm. We need to be all about truth. We need to not knowingly give in to these lies and all of these distractions and division as well. So as we kind of wrap up here, is there anything, tell us where we can find your book and more out about you and follow what you're doing, and if there's anything else you want to share as we wrap up.
Sure. The best place to find all my work is on my website, and that's my name, kayrubacek.com. So that's kayrubacek.com. And so there you can see I don't have all my work up there, but I got a lot of it. So you can see my movies, you can see some of the short and long documentaries I've done. You can see my book. I've got an email sign up there. Sign up for there. You'll find out when I've got new work coming out. And you can follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, all of sort of the regular places. And I have So my book. Okay, so my book, you can buy it on Amazon. Yes, it's an Audible, it's an audiobook, it's an ebook, all those formats. If you buy it directly from my website, then I'll sign it for you. How about that? And then we cut out the middleman. So I think if we can support independent producers to support each other in our work, and just it takes that little bit of extra step to, I do like the ease of buying from Amazon. I'm not critical of Amazon in that sense, but if we take that extra step of really thinking about where we put our dollars, and I say to my children, I've got 2 teenage children, and I say to them, do we want to, am I willing to pay for that? There's some movies where I'll just say, I'm just not willing to pay for that because I know who made it. I know why they made it. That's harmful. I'm just not going to give them my dollars. So that's another way, besides all of our attitude and way of living in our faith and everything, is we can decide with our dollars how we support each other and who we support and which companies we purchase from. And we can really look for country of origin and say, no, I don't want to support a murderous regime. And it's not that we're not supporting the Chinese people, but we know, I can say for a fact that so much of our products are made in slave labor conditions, and they are ripping off our intellectual property here in the US, like unbelievably so, that we're just giving away all of our patents and technology to the Chinese Communist Party. It's ridiculous. So we need to just be looking local, supporting each other, supporting our communities. And I think that's another way that we can really make a difference. And it does sound basic. And if I can finish on one final note, all as basic as all this sounds, that's actually the reality. The socialism is always trying to over-intellectualize, make things more complicated, make us think that if you don't have 2 degrees and a PhD and didn't go to Harvard, that you're really not worth much, and that your intellect isn't worth anything. That's just trash. That's not true. Every human being has such value. You're a walking, talking miracle when you really think about it. Science cannot explain the wonder of what goes on in your brain and your heart and your spirit, and that's why they cannot break it unless you let them. So, as sometimes people say to me, Kay, that's too basic, and I said, well, that's exactly why we must do the basics. Stop getting distracted by trying to be following false idols and thinking, I've got to be like so-and-so over there. No, be yourself. You're wonderful. And just strengthen your basics. And that's really all we need. Don't be duped by this false intellectualism that you don't need any more than what you have. And, we really can get through this. I fully wholeheartedly believe that.
Well, I know it was very important for us to end on a note of hope, and with this very heavy topic. So I'll ask a bonus question. Could you give us a little more on that, just so that we know, everybody knows this is a fight worth fighting for and there is hope?
Oh, there's a story I like to tell, a woman that I interviewed who survived brutal torture in a Chinese prison camp. And she said, we were not allowed to have eye contact in the prison, because if they caught a glimmer of eye contact with another prisoner that hadn't been broken. Tyranny is so afraid of our power. They are so afraid of the power of an individual. They are based on lies. And so this story really hit home for me when she explained. She said, we couldn't make eye contact, because if we made eye contact, we could have that glimmer that would say, I'm okay. And she said, when I saw someone and they looked at me, just for that moment, she said, I knew they hadn't broken. Okay, I'm going to hold out too. I'm not going to break. And she said, what was even more powerful was a smile, because that smile, even if it's forced, sends through your body. It sends, it has this chemical neurological reaction. It makes you feel better even when you're feeling down. But the gift that it gives to someone else who's feeling down is far greater. And so in a prison camp, these guards of tyranny, these brutish guards that had to carry out these dastardly deeds, they were so stressed trying to police even just the glances between prisoners, if they knew those were prisoners of conscience, prisoners of faith. because their glances between each other or their smile could just crush any lies that they've been implanted with in brainwashing, and it could get them through, and it did get many of them through, because they just knew, we got this. I am not alone. So again, back to basics. Know your power. Share your smile, share the gifts you have, as little as they may seem to be. It could be something that actually changes someone's life and gets them through that day and says, I am not alone. I can do this. And yes, we have God when you remember that, but in the worst of times, you may not remember that. And you have to just remember that you have someone here right next to you that will say, you're not alone on this earth right now. I'm here with you. Let's remember where we came from. So that's a story that really rang true for me. And I thought, wow, that's a great memory I don't think I'll ever forget.
Well, that is a very powerful message, and what a great note to end on. So, Kay Rubacek, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the work you're doing, the incredible work that is so important and so timely and so anointed by God for everything that needs to happen going forward. So thank you again for joining us on the show.
So glad to be here. Thank you, and thank you for your great work. Keep it up. We got to keep talking this truth.
All right. And thank you to our listeners. You can find out more from Kay at kayrubacek.com. That's KAYRUBACEK.com. And if you want to hear past episodes of this podcast, Your Faith at Work, visit ryanshoward.com and get signed up for my newsletter there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you in the next episode. God bless.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe, and you can help spread the word by leaving a 5-star review and sharing it with your friends. Visit ryanshoward.com to learn more about living the intentional, influential, and impactful life you were created for.